In a world unraveled by apocalypse, the person you trusted and loved the most has betrayed you. For years you were deceived and manipulated, just to be cheated and brutally killed. Now, armed with the bitter knowledge of betrayal and a rare second chance at life, what path would you choose? Will you seek revenge, form alliances, or perhaps merely watch as the world ignites to ashes? In a world where exposure to the sun for a mere 10 minutes cooks a person alive, and a single piece of ice cube is now worth billions, how will you write your next chapter? The story begins with a volcanic eruption. Volcanic ash and flames rain down onto the streets, yet strangely no one seems to care. It's as if it were just another normal day. On a crowded bus, everyone holds a suitcase. Among them, a young man chatters non-stop. He recently saw news about a severe undersea earthquake in Japan that caused Mount Fuji to erupt. And today, it seems to be their turn, and they were all packed and ready to leave. Sitting next to him, a young woman differs from the rest. She left home in such a hurry that she brought nothing with her, thinking she could buy supplies in another city. However, the others shook their heads, telling her that not just nearby cities but many places, large malls and warehouses had been completely cleared out. Even a massive lake had dried up overnight, and the goods mysteriously disappeared, estimated to be worth billions. At this point, a young man seated alone by the window at the back of the bus suddenly speaks up, suggesting the figure should be in the trillions. People on the bus turn to look at him as he continues, telling them that the loss of supplies and various natural disasters are just the beginning. He then drops a bombshell, telling them that the apocalypse is coming. Upon hearing this, interest wanes among most aboard. After all, conspiracy theorists and doomsayers are becoming increasingly common online. Yet, the young folks find this intriguing. The boy thinks it's a joke, even looking forward to a time when perhaps everyone might truly be equal and society can be rebuilt from the ground up. Su Chen, hearing this, has a grave look in his eyes. He thinks to himself that even if the apocalypse comes, there will never be a day of true equality. Why does he think this way? Because he has lived through it. To understand what happened, we must go back a few weeks ago, when Su Chen witnessed the apocalypse firsthand. Well, in his past life, of course. Human society crumbled and monsters rampaged, turning the entire city into a monstrous playground. A monster, thousands of meters tall with sharp teeth, numerous tentacles, and a crimson eye, emerged from a deep pit beneath the earth. At that time, Su Chen was just an ordinary delivery man, grappling with inflation, unaffordable housing, and various economic pressures just like many young people today. The cause of this was an abnormal release of solar energy that caused the Earth's core to expand rapidly, and monsters that had been lurking beneath the Earth for billions of years emerged due to tectonic movements. Human society collapsed, countless lives were lost in the disaster, and a new world with a new order was born. In this world, where resources were extremely scarce, even a packet of instant noodles could provoke deadly conflicts. And a sausage, well, this part is a bit strange, but you get the idea. I know none of you want to see this, so let's skip ahead. Su Chen, after surviving the apocalypse for several years, ended in a tragic death. The next thing he knew, he had returned a month before the apocalypse. Perhaps, it might have been a second chance given by fate. At this moment, the girl in front of him had moved next to him and clung tightly to his arm, pressing herself against Su Chen. However, before she could speak, he pushed her away and got off the bus, leaving the girl stunned and alone. Seems like our MC got his priorities right. After stepping off the bus, Su Chen looked up at the building in front of him. With the apocalypse upon him, what was most important? Naturally, it was supplies. Su Chen had a tough time in his previous life, impoverished and squandering too much time searching for supplies. This time, however, he was prepared. Dressed in his work uniform, he walked into the warehouse. The boss, holding a tablet, docked half a day's wages for simply being 21 seconds late, but Su Chen didn't care. Ironically, in his last life, the boss had fled before the apocalypse, and he never got paid for his year's work. Thinking about this, Su Chen chuckled to himself, feeling it was only right to reclaim some compensation. Suddenly, a buzzing sound came from beneath his feet, and not long after, a cubic field expanded outward from around him. A mechanical voice echoed in his mind, detecting rice, cooking oil, meat, auto-storing. Following this, The items on the warehouse shelves began to disappear along with the shelves themselves, reappearing in a massive space filled with countless other shelves. This was the ability he had gained upon his rebirth, an alternate storage. This ability allowed him to control his mind and store everything around him in a gigantic cubic space measuring 10,000 meters in all dimensions. Using this ability and the knowledge he had before the apocalypse, he drained 2 freshwater lakes and scavenged several cities destined for destruction. Watching the lively fish, he smiled. In this space, food would always remain fresh, and he no longer needed to fight others for food. Just thinking about his previous life, he even shed tears. After composing himself, he clapped his hands, and a list appeared before him detailing the supplies he had just gathered. 210 bags of rice, 310 kilograms of various fruits, from food to daily necessities, and even various spices, all meticulously listed. As Su Chen stood alone in the center of the now empty warehouse, the boss's voice echoed from the doorway, accompanied by 2 employees ready to move the goods. They rubbed their eyes as they entered, finding the vast space completely bare. The boss, furious, demanded to know where everything had gone. Su Chen simply tells them that he had taken everything. The group paused, unsure whether this was a joke, but the boss was furious and ordered his workers to capture Su Chen. One of them instinctively tried to grab him. However, Su Chen had already conjured a spatial portal. Stepping back through it, his voice carried through, telling the boss he would no longer be late. One of the employees lunged forward but grasped at the air, nearly falling face first to the ground. In the next second, Su Chen disappeared from the spot. When he reappeared, he was already outside the company. With a stylish flip through the air, he landed perfectly. And this was his second skill, spatial jumping, allowing him to freely move within a range of 3 meters. Su Chen then casually discarded his work uniform, deeming today's mission accomplished. Just then, his phone rang with an urgent notification from the government, warning of impending natural disasters and advising the public to prepare, though reassuring that these would not disrupt daily life. After reading this, he realized that the government was likely trying to avoid panic, but was already aware of the looming apocalypse. At that moment, his phone rang again. Seeing the caller ID, Su Chen's grip tightened, a hint of murderous intent flashing in his eyes. After a brief moment, he took a deep breath and answered the call. As the call connected, an angry female voice erupted from the other side. She was incredulous that Su Chen had listed their house with a real estate agency. She also told him that without a house, no woman would want to be with him. On the other end, the woman was applying lipstick, and behind her was a man lying in her bed. She kept bashing Su Chen while claiming that Su Chen lacked responsibility, saying that she was not interested in his house whatsoever, but he should still give it to her so she could feel safe. Su Chen calmly asked if there was anything else she wanted to say. Just as he was about to hang up, the woman on the line shouted, giving him one last chance, or he would never have the opportunity to marry her. Su Chen simply told her he was on his way back to Shangdu and they would talk later, then hung up. A surge of hateful memories flooded his mind. The woman on the phone was his girlfriend, or rather his fiancée, so he once believed. During the apocalypse, Su Chen had taken care of her for 5 years straight, scouring for supplies to sustain her and bringing her to a safe zone. Without him, she would have starved to death long ago. When he looked at his phone again, his gaze was cold, but more than that, it was filled with sadness and disappointment. The next scene flashed back to a memory where a blade pierced through his back and chest. Beyond the pain, he was more upset by the betrayal. A blond man, licking his lips, asked if he had handed over everything. Then, pulling out the dagger, the man jumped onto the bed and began to undress. Lying on the bed was Su Chen's fiancée, her expression cruel and mocking as she too started to remove her clothes. Each time he recalled this, he considered himself a fool for trusting such people in his past life. His fists clenched urgently, his eyes filled with murderous intent. He vowed not to let Jiang and Richard die easily. The pain he had endured, he wanted them to experience 100, 1,000 times over. Exhaling deeply, Su Chen tried to calm his emotions. All of this could wait. Right now, he needed money for the rest of the essentials. He then called the agency, even willing to sell his house at half price. But he insisted on cash and wanted to see the money today. Soon, Su Chen was back in Shangdu, arriving at the real estate agency where he spotted Jiang waiting outside the door, with Richard beside her. Jiang looked at him disapprovingly, while Richard held a wooden baseball bat in his hand. Su Chen ignored them and entered the real estate agency. Richard stepped in front of him, wielding the bat in a threatening manner, as if he had already considered Su Chen's house his own. Without missing a beat, Su Chen grabbed Richard by the neck with one hand and lifted him off the ground. The next second he slammed him hard onto the pavement. Jiang screamed and hurriedly tried to pull Su Chen away, tugging at his clothes. Su Chen backhanded her across the face, sending her sprawling onto the ground, her hand clutching her reddened cheek in disbelief. Richard on the ground looked up at Su Chen in terror, pleading for mercy. Su Chen stares down at him and then tells him that he's not going to die too quickly. He let out a cruel smile and then released his grip. Richard quickly scrambled back, coughing incessantly. Su Chen ignored both of them and walked up the steps of the agency. Jiang snapped out of her shock and shouted at Su Chen, telling him to kneel and apologize before she got really angry, or he could forget about marrying her ever. But when they met Su Chen's icy gaze, fear struck them, and they turned to run away. After entering the agency, the manager quickly poured Su Chen a glass of water, having planned to purchase his house himself. In the manager's eyes, Su Chen seemed like an idiot, selling a house worth over $1 million for just $700,000. But the manager kept these thoughts to himself. Su Chen didn't care. All he wanted was to see the money today. They swiftly signed the contract, as he knew houses and money were worthless in an apocalyptic world. Gathering $700,000 in cash was challenging, so the manager went to the bank to issue a bank draft instead. Once Su Chen received the money, he left. He knew disasters were occurring worldwide, but his inland location would likely spare it from immediate threats like earthquakes and tsunamis. Furthermore, with the government actively suppressing the spread of news, the city remained orderly. As Su Chen walked down the street, he noticed a flyer on a utility pole advertising loans, which sparked a new idea. He called the number, got the address, and quickly made his way there. Since the possession date is in a week's time, Su Chen planned to use his property deed as collateral to secure some loans. To his surprise, the lender turned out to be Richard's older brother, whom Su Chen recognized from his previous life as someone who was eaten by a beast during the very beginning of the apocalypse. The lender, a fat man smoking a cigarette, disdainfully told Su Chen that he could only lend up to $500,000 against the house, and he would need to keep the property deed. Su Chen, putting on the act of a desperate gambler, asked for an additional $100,000 and promised to return the full amount within a week after turning a profit. Hearing this, the lender inwardly sneered, but he loved to lend money to gamblers, since these people were willing to risk everything. With this in mind, he quickly transferred $600,000 to Su Chen. Meanwhile, Jiang and Richard got out of the taxi, still seething with anger and discussing plans to make Su Chen pay. They even planned to involve Richard's brother to deal with Su Chen. As they walked, they suddenly spotted a familiar figure and quickly followed. They trailed Su Chen to a hotel, a building that, in Su Chen's memory, had survived various natural disasters without collapsing, unlike other structures that had fallen due to the impact of seawater flooding and rapid freezing. Thinking ahead, Su Chen planned to use this hotel as his temporary base. Upon entering the lobby, he quickly caught the attention of the staff. A good-looking manager approached politely to see if she could assist him. Su Chen nodded and, extending a finger, told her that he wanted to book 1,000 tables of banquets. The manager was momentarily shocked, then hurriedly began to explain that banquets had different tiers and corresponding prices. Observing the handsome, well-dressed Su Chen, the manager quickly assumed he was from a super-rich family. Su Chen chose a medium-tier banquet, costing a total of $10 million, and he immediately paid $500,000 in deposit, promising to settle the rest within a week. The manager was initially hesitant, considering the deposit relatively small, but after some quick calculations about the cost of ingredients alone reaching nearly $500,000, she thought to herself that such a wealthy client wouldn't possibly deceive her, and decided to accept. They chatted for a while, after knowing Su Chen was preparing for a proposal ceremony, eventually even booking a presidential suite. This further cemented his image as a wealthy client in the manager's eyes. After paying the deposit, Su Chen left the hotel in high spirits, feeling pleased with securing a $10 million banquet for just $500,000. He wasn't concerned about his spending, In the imminent apocalyptic conditions, even a block of ice would be worth billions. As Su Chen walked away, Jiang and Richard discreetly followed him and then entered the hotel lobby. At that moment, the manager was still daydreaming about the lucky woman who would marry the handsome young man. Jiang and Richard quickly approached the manager and asked what Su Chen had been doing there. Jiang even claimed to be Su Chen's girlfriend. The manager eyed Jiang skeptically, but relayed what Su Chen had done, commenting on how fortunate she was to be marrying him. Internally, the manager only rated Jiang a 7 out of 10, feeling she herself was looking better than Jiang. She thought perhaps this was just the peculiar taste of the wealthy. Upon hearing about the 10 million banquet, Jiang and Richard were stunned and incredulous. The manager tells them that this was a typical rich person's play of hiding one's identity, suspecting that Su Chen might be testing if his partner was only after his wealth, which she sees in television dramas all the time. Despite their disbelief, when the manager showed them the payment Su Chen had made, the pair exchanged a baffled look and then left the hotel dazed. At this point, Jiang had completely forgotten their previous animosity and even started planning her future, jumping joyfully on the spot. Richard looked at her with a lecherous gaze but quickly got his hands slapped off. In her mind, she was already envisioning entering the life of the upper class. Back at home, Su Chen checked his bank balance and realized he still had many items to purchase, and the remaining 800,000 wasn't sufficient. He then thought of something and downloaded every available online lending app and managed to secure an additional 970,000. Overall, it was a very productive day, however. He couldn't afford to waste any time. He then placed numerous online orders for items like fireplaces, ice makers, blocks of ice, and smokeless coal. Given the future's extreme weather fluctuations between intense heat and severe cold, these supplies were crucial. He spent the rest of the day calling around for prices on these items. The next day, as he was about to leave the house to meet with vendors, he was greeted by a short-haired woman waving at him. It was Lena, a friend of Jiang who often criticized him behind his back. She mentioned that Jiang had been thinking about him a lot lately. Su Chen nonchalantly said their interest was more in his assets than in him. Lena did not expect this coming out of Su Chen as she hastily explained that what happened before was simply jokes. Jiang, pretending to be on the verge of tears, grabbed Su Chen's arm, pleading for his forgiveness and saying how she shouldn't have lost her temper. Su Chen simply pulled his arms away and didn't want to waste a single second with these two. However, this was the first time Jiang had seen him like this. In her eyes, Su Chen had always been a simp. Seeing him get on a car, she and Lena quickly hailed a taxi and hurried to follow him. At the ice factory, the owner greeted Su Chen eagerly when he arrived. They had already discussed the deal over the phone, 2,000 tons of edible ice, priced at 400 per ton, totaling 800,000. Su Chen agreed, and they quickly made a deal, then generously transferred 100,000 as a deposit on the spot. Watching the transaction, the factory owner became even more convinced that Su Chen was the son of a super wealthy family. As Su Chen drove away, the owner still couldn't believe that an order worth 800,000 was finished in mere seconds. Soon after, another car pulled up at the factory. Out stepped Jiang and Lena, who quickly approached the owner to ask what they were talking about. Jiang claimed to be Su Chen's fiancé. The owner was somewhat baffled, but seeing no harm in sharing, the owner told them about the 800,000 worth of ice block order Su Chen had placed. Shocked, the pair was certain that this was preparation for the proposal, and Su Chen is surely a hidden tycoon. By evening, Su Chen had completed his shopping spree, having visited all the necessary vendors. Now it was time for him to enjoy some pre-apocalyptic luxury. He found himself at a high-end restaurant, reflecting on his previous life where he had worked 18-hour days without ever having the chance to dine at such a place. Glancing at the menu, where each dish cost around 4 figures, Su Chen flipped to the last page only to see a dish represented only by a question mark, priced at 17,000. The waitress explained that this was a special dish personally prepared by the head chef. Curious, Su Chen decided to try this mystery dish. While waiting for his food, he browsed a bookshelf nearby, picking up a book that made him think about the last apocalypse and how it had caused mutations in some creatures, bringing mythical monsters to life in the real world. Soon, a slender woman with pink hair, dressed in a black chef's uniform, approached him with a plate. Introducing herself as the head chef, She explained that the dish was specially tailored to match Su Chen. Upon seeing her, Su Chen froze. He recognized the woman. This was Charlotte, also known as the Hell's Kitchen chef from his previous life. She was known for her nearly miraculous culinary skills that created irresistible dishes from mutant beasts. It's been said that her meals were tempting, but they came with the risk that eating them might be one's last act. Noticing Su Chen's expression, Charlotte was surprised. She couldn't understand why he seemed so cautious when a beautiful chef like her personally cooked and served his meal. She quickly explained the dish's name and preparation method. Su Chen then smiled, took a bite, and nodded in approval, genuinely enjoying the taste. Outside, the two of them had followed Su Chen and saw him enter the high-end restaurant. After his meal, Su Chen left the restaurant and headed to the Century Bar, a place shrouded in urban legends, including tales of people spending millions in a single night. Interested in experiencing such a venue before the apocalypse potentially wiped out such extravagances, Su Chen entered and ordered a drink. Amid the loud music, 3 girls approached him, 2 of whom were clearly regulars at the bar, and initiated a conversation. The third girl was noticeably quieter and seemed nervous. Her friends explained it was her first time here. They took her there to have some fun since her boyfriend had cheated on her. As they continued talking, it was revealed that her boyfriend had cheated on her with an older woman because she hadn't been willing to sleep with him. At the thought of this, she then downed a shot of strong liquor and boldly asked Su Chen if he was single. After getting her confirmation, she was then encouraged by her friends as she moved closer to him. Just then, Zhang and her friend burst into the bar, frantically looking for Su Chen. Seeing him, he casually drew the shy woman into his arms, offering her comfort and suggesting they go upstairs together. Perhaps captivated by Su Chen's handsome appearance and gentleness, the girl agreed as they walked towards the stairs to the second floor of the bar. Zhang and her friend tried to follow, shouting for Su Chen, but their voices were drowned out by the booming music. Once they reached the upstairs private room, Su Chen quickly closed the door behind them. He had already noticed Zhang and Lina all along. The girl with him was increasingly nervous, mentioning it was her first time, asking Su Chen to be gentle. Hearing this, Su Chen flicked her forehead to snap her back to reality, completely ruining the mood. He then tells her to stay home in the coming days and stock up on food. Although the girl was confused, she nodded and said okay. Opening the door to leave, he gave her one last piece of advice, telling her to stop coming to places like this anymore and never do things that she might regret afterward. As he stepped out, he added ominously, "Maybe there won't be an after." With that, he closed the door behind him. Despite the rare opportunity to spend a night with a beautiful girl who just broke up, he chose to act responsibly, as he wasn't the type to take advantage of someone's vulnerability. As he walked into the hallway, he saw Zhang and Lina frantically trying to break into each room, searching for him. Another day quickly passed, and he rented a warehouse. Under his direction, several large trucks began unloading one by one. Zhang and Richard followed him, puzzled by the sight of hundreds of large machines and continuous loads of coal and ice being moved into the warehouse, unable to guess what Su Chen was up to. At that moment, Lina also noticed the hotel staff, seemingly preparing for a banquet as they laid out a red carpet. Lina joked that Su Chen might be about to propose, while Zhang, hands on her hips and haughtily, acted tsundere while saying she might not accept. The group then walked over to him, and Zhang feigned surprise, asking what all this was for. Su Chen took off his jacket and glanced at them, simply telling them that if they helped move items, he would then tell them. Zhang, already adopting the persona of a wealthy lady, was naturally against such labor. Just as she was about to refuse, Lina pulled her aside, suggesting this might be another test. Enlightened, Zhang disregarded her high heels and began moving boxes, agreeing with Lina that this must indeed be a test. Lina also volunteered to help, coyly looking at Su Chen, hoping her efforts might catch his attention. He watched the two busy themselves, a cold smirk playing on his lips. He was aware they had been following him these past days, but saw no harm in utilizing the free labor. By evening, everything was moved into the warehouse, and Zhang was drenched in sweat, gasping for air, her legs trembling, vowing to one day swindle all of Su Chen's money. Lina was also shaking from exhaustion. However, the day did not turn out as they had anticipated. There were no proposals and no invited guests. Instead, Su Chen handed out red envelopes, each containing at least a couple thousand, to all of the staff and workers, including the truckers who looked nervously at the generous amount. Either way, after seeing the red envelope, all of the fatigue from the day vanished instantly. Jiang, staggering, supported herself on the warehouse door and asked him if he had forgotten to tell her something. Su Chen casually walked past her with hands in his pockets and thanked them while telling them that they could go home now. Stunned, Jiang asked if all this wasn't preparation for their marriage. She had been ready to settle down with him, but Su Chen scoffed, telling her that he had sold the house and was now deep in debt. He asked if Jiang was still willing to stay with him. Lena interjected, arguing that Su Chen had been so active lately that it was impossible he had no money. Su Chen pointed to the goods and explained that all of the stuff here was for charity, contributed by other businessmen, and he was merely assisting. Unable to hold back, Jiang furiously accused Su Chen of deceiving her and lunged at him. Su Chen dodged, and Jiang fell to the ground. Su Chen tells her that he has no interest in gold diggers. The group parted on bad terms, with the two of them storming out angrily. After watching the two leave, he then entered the warehouse and locked the door. He looked around at the fully stocked space, finally feeling at ease as he prepared for the impending apocalypse. Utilizing his special ability, he transferred all the supplies into his own alternate storage. Meanwhile, at the hotel in the evening, Zhang had returned to Richard's arms. Standing beside them was Richard's brother, Fatty Wang, who tells the two to live well, telling them he had a lot of influence, and that he can solve all of their problems if they ever need him. Richard also assured her that his brother would definitely teach Su Chen a lesson. At this point, Jiang had come to terms with not living the lavish lifestyle she had once wished for, but she was content knowing the Wang brothers were not too bad after all. Su Chen, dining nearby on a steak, mockingly said they were definitely not picky eaters. Fatty Wang recognized Su Chen as the man who had sought a loan from him days earlier. Fatty Wang shared with his brother that Su Chen had mortgaged his house to him, while Jiang and Lena gloated at the situation. Su Chen lost his appetite after seeing them. While wiping his mouth, Fatty Wang slowly approached him, reminding him that he needed to repay his debt the next day. Richard was eager to teach Su Chen a lesson, and not long after, Su Chen was fully surrounded. At this moment, the manager hurried over, and as Fatty Wang continued to make cutting remarks, the manager turned to Su Chen, asking what was going on. He assured her not to worry, dismissing them as gangster wannabe. Hearing this, Fatty Wang slammed the table and roared in anger, saying Su Chen was doomed today. Just then, a middle-aged man approached, staring coldly at Fatty Wang and demanding they not cause a disturbance tonight. Fatty Wang, breaking out in a cold sweat upon seeing the man, recognized him and quickly approached him in a subdued manner. The man continued to look coldly at Fatty Wang and ordered that there be no trouble that day, as he has an important guest coming over. Fatty Wang knew he couldn't afford to offend the man in front of him. The man's name is Gao. While dressed as a businessman, the man is a major figure in the city. Su Chen recalled this man was known as the Skull Splitter in his past life, and also how Gao had once controlled the entire city. Even the notorious Hell's Kitchen chef was also under his command. Su Chen suddenly remembered hearing that this very hotel was among the first places to witness mutant outbreaks after the apocalypse had begun. Perhaps it was here that Gao became the Skull Splitter? Noticing Su Chen's gaze, Gao looked back and smiled for the first time, intrigued by this young man. Shortly thereafter, Gao took Charlotte to the top floor to meet with President Song. President Song poured a glass of red wine for Charlotte and handed it to her, urging her to drink it. Charlotte hesitated, noticing an undissolved pill in her drink. Meanwhile, Su Chen swirled his wine glass, savoring the red wine in his presidential suite, gazing out at the brightly lit city. He vividly remembered how in his previous life, he and Jiang had survived the scorching apocalypse by hiding in a basement. Although the course of events had shifted this time, fate had brought him back to this very place. Outside, the Wang brothers were frolicking in the swimming pool, and Fatty Wang noted that right now felt warmer than daytime. However, the thought of beautiful women joining them in swimsuits made the heat bearable. Jiang and Lena, now changed into swimsuits, looked up at the moon, which was oddly bright tonight. As he gazed at the moon through the glass, he raised his glass and toasted, "Welcome to the apocalypse." No sooner had he spoken than the moon shone exceptionally bright, and suddenly, the air temperature surged dramatically. Everyone's skin turned red as if scorched, and they hurried back into the hotel for refuge. Those inside playing cards also witnessed this strange phenomenon and watched as the others burst through the doors. Their skin appeared as if it had been burned, and spotting the glass fish tank in the lobby, they plunged into it for relief. The guys were perplexed by this bizarre reaction, and one of them asked where Fatty Wang had gone. It was then that Richard remembered his brother. At that moment, a man entered, his body steaming and his skin covered in blisters, looking severely scalded before he collapsed unconscious. Back upstairs, seeing that Charlotte had hesitated to drink, President Song grew displeased. Gao quickly intervened, explaining that the banquet was ready downstairs, but Song dismissed him, coldly stating that no one dares to refuse a drink he pours. Leaving Gao no choice but to back down, Charlotte then realized Gao was trying to use her to curry favor with President Song. As Charlotte faced Song, she knew of his notorious reputation for exploiting his power against many women, and today it seemed she was his target. Aware of the likely tampered drink, she knew she couldn't refuse. Just as she was about to accept her fate, suddenly, a burst of bright light exploded behind her. The two men facing the window were momentarily blinded by the intense light. They quickly drew the curtains, but the heat when they touched the window alarmed them. Both immediately knew shit was going down. Charlotte breathed a sigh of relief that she was saved. Down in the hotel lobby, chaos erupted. The manager urged everyone to stay calm and wait for rescue. Gao arrived at the lobby, asking his subordinate Old Cat what happened. Old Cat, removing his shirt, explained that the moon had suddenly brightened, and the temperature had risen drastically. It was nearly 70 degrees Celsius outside. He added that the news reported hundreds of casualties already. Song frantically called a government official to find out what was happening. The city was in disarray, and the government could only focus on ensuring that the power station remained stable. Meanwhile, Fatty Wang, covered in blisters, his sidekicks tell him that his injuries were too severe for simple first aid. He needs to go to the hospital. While enduring the excruciating pain and sweating profusely, he called his driver, who had been waiting in a nearby underground parking lot, oblivious to the chaos outside. Upon hearing his boss's urgent voice, he quickly drove towards them. However, he was momentarily blinded by the glaring brightness and immediately felt the high temperature. The heat was so intense that soon his car tires burst. He got off the car and then called Fatty Wang, telling him what happened and how he won't be able to make it there. Suddenly, it almost felt like his skin was starting to burn. He attempted to run to a nearby building for cover, but didn't get far before his shoes melted and he tripped, falling face first onto the scorching pavement. He struggled to get back on his feet, but the sweat glued his skin onto the ground, and next moment he saw many people just like him laid on the ground. Startled by the gruesome sight, he scrambled to his feet, causing him to tear off a large piece of flesh from his face. On the other end, they could hear a loud scream. Shortly after, the screaming stopped, and they were disconnected. As chaos erupted outside, Su Chen was comfortably asleep in his suite, the air conditioner on and wrapped in his blanket. At this time, the government finally announced that the outdoor temperature had risen to 75 degrees Celsius, while the ground temperature had reached 100 degrees. Everyone was advised not to go outside and find refuge in the basement. Suddenly, a huge explosion was heard from the city's power center. Fatty Wang tried to call several more times, but no one answered. He suspected something bad had happened, and now the hotel had only one room left, and his group gathered in the same room all together. Jiang and Lena still hesitated to share a room with a group of men and demanded a separate space. Suddenly, the room's electricity cut out, shutting down the lights and air conditioning. Within moments, everyone was drenched in sweat, likely facing temperatures of around 40 degrees inside. Jiang then thought of Su Chen's presidential suite, which included a pool, and suggested they take it over. Meanwhile, Su Chen, unaffected by the outage, enjoyed a swim in his pool. He was well aware from his previous life that a maintenance failure at the city's power station had been a prelude to the apocalypse, leading to immediate power outages. This was precisely why he had chosen a room with a pool. Moreover, he had taken out a portable air conditioner and 2 battery backups from his alternate storage, alongside 2 massive ice blocks and a bottle of red wine. It's clear that he was more than comfortable. Feeling peckish, he retrieved some of the banquet's fine foods from his storage. Bread, seafood, meats, cakes, and fruits, all looking very appetizing. Just as he was about to enjoy a bite, someone banged on his door. As the door opened, the cool air from his room wafted out, and Fatty Wang thought he was in paradise. When Su Chen saw it was them, he asked what they wanted. Richard didn't respond, and instantly spotting what was inside, he wanted to rush in, accusing Su Chen of being selfish. Fatty Wang didn't hesitate and tried to take over the room. As he stepped one foot inside, a gunshot rang out, and a bullet penetrated his stomach, causing a burning sensation. He looked down at his bleeding stomach. Only then did everyone notice that Su Chen had a gun. The shot wasn't lethal, only wounding him. Fatty Wang trembled, his eyes filled with anger, and then another gunshot pierced his thigh. He quickly crawled back out of the room. He then warned everyone, stating that with another step inside, they would face death. In the hotel's ground floor lobby, everyone huddled together as Gao angrily questioned the manager about the lack of food in such a large hotel. The manager continuously apologized, explaining that a recent banquet had depleted their supplies a few days earlier. Song then opened a bottle of water, poured it over himself to cool down, and demanded that any available food and water be brought up to him. Hearing this, the rest of the patrons were not happy. Despite their fear of Song and his subordinates, no one could stay silent any longer, knowing they wouldn't survive without food and water. Suddenly, a group burst out from the back, screaming for help. Gao instantly noticed Fatty Wang's gunshot wounds. Before anyone could explain what had happened, Jiang stood out from the crowd, shouting that Su Chen's room had electricity, air conditioning, and food. Hearing this, others gathered around, and some of the brave ones decided to demand Su Chen to share his resources. Knowing Su Chen has a gun, Gao calmly instructs his men to stay at the very back. Despite some of the patrons' fears of Su Chen's gun, they felt emboldened by their numbers. Soon, they once again knocked on Su Chen's door. When the door was opened, they immediately felt the cool breeze coming their way, and several faces lit up with excitement. A middle-aged man spoke first, while others quickly chimed in that Su Chen should share his room and whatever he had with everyone. A young chubby boy saw fried chicken on the table and excitedly ran towards it while sticking out his tongue. However, he quickly learned a valuable lesson today. What followed was Su Chen sternly warned the parents to better control their child, or he would take matters into his own hands. At that moment, their fake smile tore away as the crowd prepared to forcibly evict Su Chen. Suddenly, a gunshot was heard, and a bullet precisely struck a muscular man at the back of the group. Everyone halted in shock. Su Chen then spoke with a menacing tone, telling them, "I may be alone, but you all have just one life." Seeing Su Chen fired the shot, they instinctively backed away. At the same time, back to the first floor, Richard furiously asked why did they leave his brother outside. Fatty Wang's sidekicks hurriedly pulled him back, preventing him from going out, telling him that Fatty Wang had succumbed to his infected wounds and dehydration. Hearing this, Richard blamed everything on Su Chen. By this time, everyone on the upper floors had fled, leaving only Zhang and Lena behind. They got in front of the camera at the doorway, completely soaked from the extreme heat. They danced and even hugged each other, trying to seduce Su Chen, while promising him that they would do anything if he let them in. As the door opened, a rush of cool air greeted them, and they were overjoyed. However, little did they expect, Richard charged out, while screaming that he was going to kill Su Chen. Just as he reached to grab Su Chen's collar, Su Chen pulled out a baseball bat from nowhere, and without missing a beat, swung it at Richard's face, causing him to be knocked back several meters, crashing into the two girls. The bat thudded heavily on the ground as Su Chen asked who else wanted to come in. They took a look at the bat, and another look at Richard. Fear gripped both of them. He then warned them if they tried to do any more tricks, there won't be another chance. The two didn't even bother with Richard and ran downstairs, with Richard awkwardly scrambling to follow them, rolling and crawling as he went. With high-precision automatic weapons installed in the room, Su Chen settled back onto the sofa. Meanwhile, a special armored vehicle arrived at the hotel's entrance. Several soldiers, fully equipped and in protective gear, made their way into the hotel. Ignoring the cheers from the hotel guests, the soldiers were on a mission to find Professor Liu. An elderly man stepped forward, and after his identity was confirmed, the soldiers instructed him to don a heat-resistant suit and prepare to leave with them. Seeing this, others surged forward, hoping to be rescued as well. The soldiers calmly informed everyone that a rescue operation was already underway, set to commence at midnight when temperatures were at their lowest. They advised everyone who could make it to head to the plaza on their own. This announcement sparked cheers, even from Gao, who cracked a rare smile. Suddenly, Song squeezed from the crowd, desperately reaching for the heat-resistant suit, saying he wanted to buy it for 100 million. One of the soldiers swiftly restrained him, explaining that the professor was their geological expert, crucial for understanding the disaster. Song then turned to Gao, yelling at him to help him. Hearing this, the soldiers raised their guns, ready to shoot should anyone make a threatening move. At this moment, Zhang broke from the crowd and grabbed a soldier's arm, telling him that there was a murderer upstairs. Lena nodded in agreement, and others in the crowd supported their claim. One young soldier glanced over, seemingly prepared to stay behind to investigate. Another soldier advised him not to act rashly, but the younger soldier assured him he could handle the situation. He took off the suit and proceeded upstairs with his weapon drawn. Zhang had everything planned out. Once Su Chun was neutralized, they could take over his room and comfortably wait for rescue. The soldier, alert with every step, finally reached the top floor. As he approached the presidential suite, he spotted a hidden camera in a flower bed. Suddenly, the door to Su Chen's suite opened, and a flashbang was thrown out. He tried to close his eyes in time, but it was too late. Then, he heard a sizzling sound and realized it was tear gas. Quickly covering his nose and closing his eyes, he attempted to retreat, but was caught off guard by a figure who appeared behind him and knocked him unconscious with a baseball bat. When the soldier regained consciousness, his eyes still stung, but his body felt unexpectedly cool. He found himself tied up by Su Chen. Upon inspecting the soldier's credentials, Su Chen learned that he was the deputy captain of a special forces unit. Embarrassed by his predicament, the soldier, realizing how dire his situation had become, hurriedly asked Su Chen who he was and how he had obtained such weapons. Su Chen nonchalantly claimed he was just a recent graduate who had brought the weapons back from a trip to the Middle East, and the soldier didn't believe a single word. Su Chen, unconcerned with the soldier's skepticism, laid out the government's upcoming plans. The soldier was stunned. He wondered how he had access to such sensitive information. While reflecting on his past life, Su Chen explained that although temperatures would drop significantly at midnight, exposure for more than 10 minutes outside could still cause fainting, and many would likely die on their way to safety. The soldier hung his head, lamenting that the rescue vehicles were difficult to modify, and they lacked sufficient manpower to save everyone. Su Chen patted him on the shoulder, telling him that thick blankets and thick cotton clothing, though hot, could also serve to block out the sun and insulate against the UV rays, potentially saving more lives. The soldier, visibly relieved by the suggestion, knew that Su Chen was likely going to kill him. However, he pleaded with Su Chen to let him relay this message to his comrades before killing him, begging to use the radio and promising not to call for backup. Just as he braced for the worst, Su Chen untied him. He knew the soldier was being used by the people downstairs. He didn't want to kill him, but warned that his tolerance wouldn't extend to a second time. Still confused, the soldier asked Su Chen if he wasn't afraid he would go outside and call for reinforcements. Su Chen simply smiled and pointed in a direction. There, the soldier saw a sentry gun tower. Rubbing his wrists, the soldier donned his clothes and went down to the lobby, where he shared the tip about using blankets and cotton clothing for protection. He then left in his heat-resistant suit, without his weapon. It was at this moment that they finally found out how terrifying Su Chen really was. Song, in a fit of rage, slapped Gao across the face, berating him for not listening to him, then lashed out at his other subordinates. Old Cat, with a cold gaze, asked Gao how much longer he intended to endure this. Gao took a deep breath, noting that after world order was restored, they would still need the Fatass's connections, so they had no choice but to tolerate the situation for now. As Su Chen descended the stairs, he mocked Gao, questioning if he truly believed that societal order would be restored. Old Cat wanted to punch Su Chen but was restrained by Gao. It turned out Su Chen wanted to make a deal with Gao, and then he poured out ice from an insulated cup. Old Cat went crazy and lunged for the ice, yelling that if they killed Su Chen, everything in the room would be theirs. But his rampage was cut short as he raised his hands in surrender, Turned out Su Chen was holding a rifle to his neck. Gao gulped nervously and decided to hear him out. Minutes later, Gao and Old Cat were enjoying the cooling relief of the ice, savoring what felt like a slice of heaven. Gao plotted in his mind to agree to Su Chen's terms for now, but once he finds an opportunity to kill him, he will then take over the room. At that moment, Song noticed the two savoring the ice. He kicked Gao in the stomach and stomped on his head before taking some ice for himself. He then noticed Charlotte, still dressed in her suit despite the heat. Seeing how her clothes had been soaked by sweat, revealing her wonderful figure, he then grabbed her wrist, intending to drag her to his room. Charlotte slapped him across the face, but Song, in a rage, tore apart her clothes, just as he was about to take it a step further. Humiliated, Charlotte covered herself with her hands, glaring angrily at him. Gao then intervened, scolding Song for going too far. Song turned to shout at Gao, but in the next second, a dagger was plunged deeply into his neck. Song fell to his knees, unable to believe what was happening as blood flooded his throat. Gao knew Su Chen was right. This was the apocalypse, and things were not going back to normal. Thus, there was no place for people like Song anymore. He then turned to the crowd, telling everyone that he was in charge now, and they all needed to make a choice. Either head to the rescue point at midnight or die here. Charlotte watched in disbelief, while Su Chen observed from the second floor, quietly taking in the drama. He knew exactly what kind of person Gao was from their past life, and now he saw an opportunity to use him for his next plan. He then took a final look, as Song's body was soon thrown outside, right beside Fatty Wang's. He just has to wait now. As the lobby cleared out, with most returning to their rooms to prepare for the evacuation, Jiang and Lena stayed behind. After Gao finished most of the ice water, he carelessly tossed the last bit to them. Old Cat, confused about why they weren't heading to the rescue point, listened as Gao told him that the world was essentially ending, and they had to rely on themselves. He doubted anyone could safely make it to the rescue point just a kilometer away. Old Cat looked at the three and wondered why Gao decided to keep around seemingly useless people, to which Gao scoffed, explaining it was Su Chen's request. At midnight, everyone, including Jiang and Lena, gathered in the lobby, draped in thick blankets. Just as they fantasized about being rescued, Old Cat suddenly yanked their blankets away and dragged them back. The others pretended not to see and rushed out of the hotel. However, it wasn't long before they were all gasping for air. The blankets could block the sun, but the external heat was still overwhelming. Gao had given them no water or food, leaving them sure to die if they stayed. But the extreme heat outside posed a serious threat as well. Many had tied wooden boards to their feet to insulate against the scorching ground, but the intense heat was still unbearable. One person tripped over, falling onto the ground that soared over 100 degrees Celsius. The greasy sweat on his skin sizzled upon contact, quickly melting away the flesh. His screams echoed, but no one stopped to help. In such a desperate situation, where survival was uncertain, the instinct to prioritize oneself over strangers became overwhelmingly apparent. As more people fell, no one was there to help them. At the same time, the bodies of Song and Fatty Wang, which had been lying outside, began to undergo some transformation. Their scorched skin emitted an eerie glow, and suddenly their eyes turned blood red as they stood up. Inside, Su Chen watched from the second floor as people scrambled, reminiscent of his past life when he too had struggled. But no one told him about the blanket, and people began to fall one by one with no one there to help them. Meanwhile, in the lobby, Jiang and Lena are terrified of what will happen to them. Suddenly, Song and Fatty Wang, now blazing with flames on their body, shattered the glass and entered the hotel. The dramatic scene was straight out of a horror movie, and immediately they recognized them as zombies. In a panic, Gao grabbed Richard, using him as a shield. When they made contact, Richard let out a loud scream as the searing pain was like touching a hot brazier. Gao then quickly retracted his hand. Su Chen then walked down from the second floor with a long sword in hand, commanding everyone to clear a path. He knew these creatures were not really zombies, but actually drought demons from ancient mythology, given that the corpses mutated under the sun's intense rays during the apocalypse. Unlike typical zombies, these mutations didn't spread through bites. Su Chen, having anticipated this moment, watched as the mutated Song walked right past him and headed straight for Gao. Turned out, These mutated monsters hold residual memories from the past. Meanwhile, Fatty Wang lunged at Su Chen. Su Chen deftly dodged and, with a swift movement, leaped and struck down Song first. Turned out, this was his plan all along. As he had anticipated, a purple crystal core emerged from Song's head. Su Chen grabbed the core and then evaded Fatty Wang's second attack. With a swift kick, he kicked Fatty Wang toward the group. Seeing Su Chen leaving them, Gao cursed under his breath and quickly picked up the unconscious Richard to use as a shield again. He then pushed with all his strength and urged everyone to grab a weapon. Back in his room, Su Chen first washed the core, then took out a bottle of whiskey and dropped the purple crystal core into it. Such cores, which appeared in less than 1% of mutated beasts during the apocalypse, could potentially enhance one's body with absorbed energy when consumed. However, the process was excruciating. Almost immediately, an explosive power spread throughout his body, feeling as if it was about to tear him apart. His veins bulged gruesomely as his skin and organs seemed to burn from within. He collapsed onto pre-prepared ice blocks, which rapidly melted under the intense heat. Downstairs, they finally managed to deal with Fatty Wang. However, the heat emanating from his body was so intense that it melted nearby plastic bottles, destroying their last reserves of drinking water. As Lena and Zhang attempted to sneak away, they were quickly discovered. In a panic, Lena had to save herself. She didn't even hesitate as she yelled out that she had a perfect plan to deal with Su Chen, but asked them to allow her to leave afterward. Old Cat, a bit skeptical, grabbed her and threatened her to not play any tricks. Lena, desperate, pointed to Zhang and revealed that she was Su Chen's fiancée. She then suggested that they could ambush Su Chen by using Zhang as bait when he opened his door. Zhang's face turned pale as she incredulously stared at Lena. She couldn't believe that she was betrayed. Old Cat, however, liked the idea. Zhang knew she was done for. With no way out, she then demanded food before she would cooperate. However, the refrigerator had long stopped working due to the power outage, and any meat had spoiled in the extreme heat. Gao then handed Zhang a dagger, telling her if she wanted to eat, then do it herself, as he pointed towards Lena. Sweat poured down her forehead as her gaze lingered on Lena. Only hesitating for a moment, Zhang finally grasped the dagger and walked toward Lena. The betrayal and the dire circumstances had driven her to the edge. Thinking of her grim fate and fueled by rage, she charged at Lena while screaming and cursing her. The scene was so gruesome enough to make even Old Cat and Gao frown. After her outburst, she bellowed that Su Chen would be next. Gao then instructed Old Cat to find Charlotte first, saying that they needed to eat and regain strength before they could fight Su Chen. Old Cat was a bit reluctant, but knowing there was no other way, gritting his teeth, he nodded. Meanwhile, Su Chen was in his room, getting used to his newly enhanced body. His speed was astonishing, darting around the room so quickly that he was almost a blur. His strength, speed, stamina, and heat resistance had all significantly increased. A casual punch from him could shatter dozens of kilograms of ice into fragments. At that moment, he noticed a figure appearing on his camera. It was Charlotte. When Su Chen saw it was Charlotte at the door, he hesitated momentarily but decided to open it, momentarily forgetting that his clothes had been torn by the intense heat. Charlotte, unexpectedly seeing the massive, she blushed and let out a startled scream. Su Chen quickly apologized and invited her into his room. He then got dressed, and the two sat across each other. Charlotte explained that she was seeking his protection. Su Chen didn't agree with the point, but pointed out that his resources were limited, and he couldn't shelter anyone just because they had a pretty face. However, internally, he recalled Charlotte's history from his past life, and he had once indeed considered having her join him, but after what happened earlier, it was too awkward if he said it first. Still slightly embarrassed, Charlotte explained why she was valuable. Not only was she a chef, but she also graduated with honors from a medical school and had 3 years of experience as a surgical doctor. Meanwhile, she was actually thinking just how great Su Chen's body was. No, she meant how great Su Chen's room was, with all that food and electricity. Su Chen, seemingly unimpressed, tells her that it wasn't enough. In desperation, Charlotte stood up and quietly said she would do anything to avoid being sent away. Su Chen was slightly taken aback. That's not really what he meant, but either way, he chuckled softly. He nodded, agreeing to let her stay. Charlotte was unnerved by his smile, regretting her hasty offer. Su Chen then sternly warned her not to harbor any schemes, which Charlotte nodded. As Su Chen looked her over, he instructed, "Now, take off your clothes." Charlotte stepped back, trembling when she heard this. What were you all thinking? Su Chen was merely checking if Charlotte had any weapons hidden and wanted her to take a shower first. Shortly after, Charlotte entered the bathroom, marveling at how much supplies Su Chen had. It was like a paradise where she didn't have to fear being eaten by others. However, she shook her head. Just moments before, Su Chen had lifted Charlotte's chin. "All right, guys, I know y'all don't like the details, so I will just skip them for you." When Charlotte came out from the shower, she had changed into the tight nurse outfit Su Chen had selected for her, which he examined with satisfaction. Then, a loud bang sounded from outside, and someone pleaded for help. Su Chen knew they were up to no good. Charlotte quickly urged Su Chen not to open the door, explaining that the group had already devoured Lena, and that was why she ran up there. Upon knowing that the group outside had resorted to cannibalism, Su Chen frowned, but still opened the door. Outside, the four of them looked awful, with bulging veins, blood-red eyes, and sharp teeth. Hiding in a corner, one person armed with a dagger lunged at Su Chen's neck, but Su Chen subdued him effortlessly and dislocated the man's arm with a twist. The group was stunned, but Zhang broke free and ran towards Su Chen, screaming for help. In the next second, Su Chen grabbed her by the neck, seeing Zhang, who had now turned into a monster, remarking on how cannibalism during the apocalypse could mutate the human body. And now, they can no longer call themselves human. The rest of them didn't care how they looked, and were focused solely on survival. Zhang lunged at Su Chen for the second time, who looked disappointed, and kicked her through the hotel's glass window. However, she clung to the wall, glaring at Su Chen and vowing for revenge, but the next moment, she felt the scorching heat from the walls. Meanwhile, the others drew their daggers and charged at Su Chen, not giving him the chance to draw his gun. Su Chen smirked. Suddenly, one of them leaped at him, but in the next moment, a pistol appeared in his hand, and a shot was fired, the bullet piercing the monster's skull, spewing purple blood onto the walls. The rest of them quickly dispersed. Gao was surprised, but knew with their enhanced strength, speed, and reflexes, as long as they were prepared, there was no way they could be shot. Soon, they encircled Su Chen from all directions. Afterward, Su Chen indeed missed all of his shots. Old Cat then descended from the ceiling. However, Su Chen grabbed him and violently smashed his head to the ground. Another bald man charged at Su Chen, thrusting a knife towards him. With one hand, Su Chen took control, brutally yanking and pulling off the man's arm, then using the dismembered limb to strike another attacker. In mere seconds, only Gao remained, furiously rushing at Su Chen with clenched fists. However, the disparity in strength was too great, and in the next second, Su Chen grabbed him by the neck and slammed him against the wall, causing the wall to crack. Suddenly, a figure engulfed in flames leaped through a window into the corridor. Su Chen immediately recognized her as Zhang. However, she had once again mutated. Without hesitation, Su Chen snapped Gao's neck with a powerful squeeze and turned his cold gaze towards Zhang. With a roar, the monster extended a long tongue, and bone spikes protruded from her body. Charlotte, standing behind the door, watched in disbelief. Knowing she needed to prove her worth or risk being abandoned by Su Chen, Charlotte had an idea. She got back to the room and then called out to Su Chen, who glanced back to see her holding a whip, saying she wanted to help. Su Chen looked at her curiously. He was surprised to see her not hiding, but he doubted she could be of any help, and told her it was more of a distraction than help. Confused, Charlotte looked down at her outfit and the whip she was holding. Her face quickly turned red. As the monster roared again and lunged at Su Chen with incredible speed, it clawed at his chest, but it didn't cause any harm, other than his torn clothes. The monster, undeterred, jumped behind him and tried to bite his neck, but its fangs couldn't penetrate his skin. The battle reached its climax as Su Chen grabbed the creature's arms, flipped it over his shoulder, and stepped on its back. With a forceful pull, he tore off its arms and violently slammed it into the ground. The monster howled in pain. Reflecting on Zhang's betrayal in a previous life, Su Chen had spent 5 years protecting her, giving her everything he had. He lost count of how many times he almost died in search of food, only to be repaid with betrayal and cheating. Suddenly, the monster used its tail to coil around a nearby corpse and swallowed it whole. Remarkably, its severed arms began to regenerate, eliciting another roar from the monster, its eyes burning with increased fury towards Su Chen. This surprised Su Chen, marking the first time he had witnessed a beast regrow its limbs. Charlotte also watched in disbelief, never thought this would be possible. Su Chen was initially shocked, but then murmured, "It's perfect." Charlotte thought she had misheard, just to hear Su Chen add, "Doesn't this mean it won't die so easily?" His eyes gleamed with hatred. This time, he was the one attacking, appearing behind the monster in a flash. He grabbed and tore off one of its arms, then the other, but the limbs regrew each time. Su Chen repeated this process many times. After minutes, the monster began to cry, while in a hoarse voice asking,
"Why are you doing this?"
After hearing her voice, the intense adrenaline rush of revenge gradually faded. Su Chen took another look at her, memories of the past flooding back. He recalled the many times he had brushes with death in the post-apocalyptic world to bring her food and lead her and Richard to the safe zone, only to be brutally betrayed and killed by them once they got there. In this new life, he vowed never to be betrayed again. Perhaps it was time to let go. With a single strike, he ended the monster's life. Charlotte, terrified by the scene, carefully asked Su Chen if he was okay. However, he turned to her with bloodshot eyes, slowly walked towards her, and asked if she was ready. She was startled and didn't know what he meant. But before she could react, Su Chen had scooped her up from behind. "I know you guys probably don't care about the details, so let's just skip ahead one more time. Anyway, it's already past midnight, and the military is stationed at the rescue points, however. It's been hours, but there's only a handful of people who got here." Feeling the slight cool breeze, it seemed the temperature had dropped significantly. Could the apocalypse be ending? A woman looked into the distance while murmuring to herself. A soldier behind her suddenly noticed a large crowd approaching from a distance, but he quickly sensed something was off. The female commander widened her eyes in horror and ordered everyone to evacuate the civilians who had already arrived at the rescue point, while she stayed back to provide cover. The rest of her team wanted to stay and help, but she ordered them firmly to go, leaving them no choice but to obey. Grabbing a nearby machine gun, she started firing rapidly. Many drought demons fell, but will she survive? We then switched the scene back to the hotel. Meanwhile, after round 1, round 2, round 3, the two then laid in bed. Su Chen knew he should be moving on to his next plan now since the heat disaster had passed. He then tells Charlotte that he will be gone for a few days while telling her to stay here. When she asks if she can follow him, he shakes his head. As round 4 was about to start, let's skip ahead again because I know none of you care about the details. Later in the night, Su Chen left the hotel and summoned a jeep from his alternate storage. He knew the seawater would soon flood the area, so he had to act fast. In his previous life, the rescue operation hadn't gone all success. When citizens heard about the rescue points, they rushed over, but only a few managed to reach there safely, while others collapsed halfway and turned into drought demons. Since they were all so determined to reach the rescue points before they died, ultimately drove them to form a large horde and attacked the rescue point when they turned into drought demons. While some civilians were rescued, many, especially soldiers, died during the swarm, leaving scattered weapons that were soon picked up by people who later formed various gangs and factions. One such group was these 3 idiots, who decided to stand in the middle of the road and point their guns at Su Chen. The guy in the front brandished a pistol, forcing him to step out of his vehicle. This made him chuckle. Who would have thought people would still be robbing others at a time like this? Obvious he isn't going to comply as he floored the gas pedal and rammed them off the road. Well, this is the apocalypse world. You never trust anyone. Minutes later, he got out of the car and gazed down into the deep pit, reflecting on how the intense sun and the drought demon horde had caused the subway station to collapse just like his previous life. He peered into the shadows and saw countless pairs of crimson eyes. He knew there must have been thousands of them down there. While he needed the cores, it would be too much of a time sink to take them out one by one now. He then headed toward a nearby university. Once inside, he summoned the jeep back into his storage and entered through the main gates. He was greeted by 2 chained drought demons and several people lounging on the sofas. Su Chen smiled and pulled a chicken drumstick from his backpack, offering it as a peace gesture, so maybe they can let him pass. The moment the men saw the chicken drumstick, their eyes lit up, and they demanded that Su Chen hand over everything. Su Chen tossed it to them. Then, the three of them lunged for the drumstick together. But as they scrambled over it, they noticed that the drumstick was moving, or precisely it was being pulled back by a thin string. Realizing that Su Chen was playing them, they got really angry and grabbed the baseball bats and charged at him. Su Chen swiftly took care of them and then made his way upstairs, all the while thinking, why are there so many idiots around? Could it be that his warnings helped too many people survive? Anyway, relying on his memory, he located the laboratory, a facility dedicated to studying snake biology. Finding the door locked and seeing that no one had been there in some time, he tore off the lock with his bare hands. Since his body was enhanced, turning open a lock is no big deal now. Inside, the lab was relatively clean, but the air was thick with the stench of rotten smell. Obviously, most of the snakes had died here. He walked further in and finally found what he was searching for in a corner, a king rat snake, currently devouring the head of another snake. Seeing it, Su Chen realized how this snake had managed to survive so long. In its glass enclosure, it was the only one still alive. The rest were either obviously dead or already in its stomach. The king rat snake looked kinda cute, but Su Chen couldn't help but recall how, in the previous life, it had been one of the earliest cases of atavistic mutation, turned into a massive creature that ended up devouring many people, and Su Chen himself nearly ended up as its prey. Since he knew a massive flood would occur in a week, and the snake would start mutating at that point, he doubted he could take it on once it had mutated. However, at this point, the king rat snake had been staring at him intently, flicking its tongue in and out, hissing at him. Could it be that it had already evolved some form of intelligence? While Su Chen was lost in thought, he heard some footsteps behind the wall.